Good day, everyone, once again. This is John Cap from Community Systems Foundation. I'm here in New York City and looking forward to the forthcoming webinar. In fact, you may know I'm in New York City if you can hear the sirens behind me. No emergencies here, just a day in the life in Midtown Manhattan. We're very glad to have you all with us, and we look forward to the first in the CSF webinar series for 2018. The topic of the discussion today is Data for All transition strategies, and we look forward to the conversation to follow in this webinar. Our approach today will be a presentation of some ideas from CSF in regard to transitions toward monitoring for SDGs. And throughout the session, we very much hope to have an interactive discussion with you. In terms of housekeeping and an approach to this webinar, we would suggest that as the presentation goes forward, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat in this webinar window to share them directly. We're scheduling time for questions, answers, and discussions at the end of the presentation, and we will most definitely circle back to your questions at that time. If you'd like to verbally share a question or a comment, you could also use the chat to indicate that you'd like a chance to speak, and when the time comes, the moderator will give you a signal and we will engage your microphones. The webinar will be recorded, and soon after the session we will be making the link to the recording available and the slides as well. So we hope at this stage we're in a position to begin. We're most looking forward to the discussions today following the presentation and hearing your thoughts on the topics at hand. Once again, my name is John Cap. I'm the Executive Director of Community Systems Foundation. I feel it may be helpful to begin with a very short introduction to the organization. Some of you know CSF very well from working with us in the past, but I recognize that others may be new to the organization. Community Systems Foundation is a not-for-profit organization registered here in the United States. We have a small office in New York City, but most of our work happens abroad, happens in countries around the world. We have very much a global portfolio of projects, and we work in support of strengthened information systems in the field of development very generally. We work in areas of health, education, agriculture, labor, planning, in supporting national governments and agencies to better use data for decision making. And in fact, this is the impetus behind this webinar and the topic of the day, a transition strategy toward better approaches to monitoring and reporting on the SDGs. Many of you may have received from me several weeks ago an approach that CSF is taking now in transitioning to SDG monitoring. And that involves a bit of our history. CSF has been working with countries around the world and UN partners in the monitoring of the Millennium Development Goals for many years. And we were doing so using a platform called DevInfo. And for many of the countries that have been working in this area, significant effort has been put into building data repositories and building information systems. And we feel very strongly that that data can be put to very good use in a longitudinal way, moving toward the monitoring of the Sustainable Development Goals and the related indicators. So the aim of this webinar is, in fact, to discuss some suggestions for a transition strategy, how CSF sees that working, and to set some examples of the work already in hand in many countries around the world. So without further introduction, I'll begin. We look forward to your comments throughout. The first section of the presentation is very much around the idea of moving from monitoring of the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. In that, we all realize that the effort and the expanse of the indicators now related to the Sustainable Development Goals have changed the context dramatically in terms of our work in the area of monitoring and reporting. The number of indicators have expanded, and the data required for monitoring the Sustainable Development Goals has also expanded. And we feel very strongly that while the tools used during the MDG era were very helpful, that there's really a new requirements now from the SDGs to both upgrade technology and upgrade an approach to monitoring and reporting. So very simply, I want to reflect on first DevInfo. If you're a former DevInfo user, you recall that DevInfo was really designed in two modules. And at the center of all of this was a database, a data warehouse. For those administering a data warehouse, we use DevInfo Admin, a tool for creating indicators, for aligning maps, for developing a structure of the database for the capture of information around the Millennium Development Goal indicators, but also national priorities. For those who are using the data, DevInfo User module was the entry point. And that, of course, allowed a search of the data and then allowed for the visualization of data from that directly. And these two tools have been widely used in implementation of DevInfo projects worldwide. But again, at the center of this is a data warehouse. And we feel very strongly, for reasons I'll explain in a few minutes, that the data warehouse, in fact, remains very relevant and can continue to be leveraged as we move toward new technologies and new approaches to monitoring the SDGs. We see it like this. Under the Data for All initiative, that data warehouse still exists and can be, of course, strengthened, amended with new data and new time series data for existing indicators. But the tools to access the data in this warehouse are now being updated. And under the Data for All initiative, we think about these tools in four categories, no longer just admin and user, but four categories of data tools that we'll be discussing in this presentation. Those range from data capture tools, ways to collect and consume data and bring it into the data warehouse, tools to manage the data, and then tools for the use of data. And we divide this into two sections, the analysis of data and the strategic use of data. And from our perspective, we're looking at a series of smaller modules that together build a system that we believe is much more powerful and more appropriate for the needs of monitoring the Sustainable Development Goals. I'll pause here to say a bit more about the system. The tools under DFA all are very much built in an open source model. So as the Data for All community grows, the contributions of one country will be the benefits of another. And so that model of contributing and sustaining through a community of open source users is one that we feel very strongly about. At the same time, as you see here, or when you'll see in slides to follow, not only open source is critical to this, this set of tools, but also the ability to link together and use tools in a larger way. That means we are designing solutions that we call loosely coupled and tightly integrated. That allows for us to take one module and apply it in a country where certain systems may already exist to enhance that system, or to package together many tools in a way that allows to build a new system from scratch. And I'll say a bit more about that in the slides to follow. Underneath these four categories of tools are a range of categories to better begin to support the needs in terms of monitoring and reporting the SDGs. I won't speak to each of these areas directly, but just to say that these reflect what I would call a category of tools, and within them options for using software to support system strengthening. In the section that follows, we will be looking at a few examples of this. And so from here, I'll move into what we think is most critical and something we discuss very often in all of our work. That is the underlying standards that will allow us to make a smooth transition from DevInfo into Data for All. We understand that technology will always evolve, but with standards, the data can persist, and we feel very confident that the data warehouse with DevInfo was built for purpose and built for future, and with standards underlying it allows us to take an approach that technology around it can change, but the data will remain. I'm going to speak about standards in two ways. The beginning of this presentation will look now at the structure of the database, something we call a DSD, or data structure definition, to help you understand the approach that was taken in building a DevInfo database and the approach that we still think has relevance as we begin to monitor the SDGs. And I'll begin with an example here, an observation like this, 76. Any data value that you could see in any of your databases. But to understand this observation, there's a series of information that's required. And we think that this model works quite well. I want to speak to this next. So to understand the number 76, the information around this wheel is quite critical in our minds. So let me explain how that would look. A series, for example, relates to literacy. The unit of measure could be rate in percent. The time period would be a year reference, a day reference, a month reference. And the source of the data. Here we've used the standard source convention where we look at the publication, the publisher, and the year of publication in a very standard way. Of course, a geographic area. I've chosen for this example Brazil, but of course we could look above in regional categorizations of geographic areas, or below in subnational geographic areas. And then in green to the right of the slide, the dimensions of the data, the disaggregations, if you will, of the data. Here are three standards that were used within the DevInfo database: location, urban, rural, or beyond, sex, male or female, or other, and age, any range of age groups that can be defined within the database. We still believe that this structure remains relevant. We'd be very happy to hear your comments on that if you see areas where this can be improved. One area we know that can be improved is the further expansion of dimensions, and that's something that we worked on with DevInfo, but we see that as even more so critical in the monitoring the SDGs. Some examples. Looking at ethnicity, language, mother tongue, ability or disability. And in our new tools, we've introduced the open-ended dimension, N in this case, so that if there are other dimensions that exist that need to be captured in your database, they can be added as well. But as we look at the mandate of leaving no one behind, I think even more critical are the combination of these. It's the rural female that speaks a language other than the national language, and maybe from an ethnic minority group. That data point is extremely critical in reaching and ensuring that no one is left behind in the SDGs. And so the Data for All data structure allows us to define our dimensions as specifically as possible, and then collecting and using data accordingly. Beyond the structure of the database now, I want to talk about some underlying principles or data standards that we are using and we have been using as we move from DevInfo into Data for All. Again, these are, in our mind, the type of standards that allows that transition to take place. They're existing within the Data for All database, and we see them as critical under Data for All as well. The first is more of a principle of open data. The concept that all public socioeconomic human development data should be freely available to everyone for use. This is something that is becoming much more widespread. It began with an initiative from the World Bank several years ago, I think as one lead agency that took an approach to saying all data should be in the public good. And since then, there's been a strong push by countries, by agencies to take forward that same approach. An open data platform is one that can be developed with DFA tools, and one that we think is critical in the success of monitoring and achievement of the SDGs. The next standard that we feel is critical to our sustainability and the sustainability of the Data for All initiative is open source software. I won't speak more about it. I mentioned it earlier in the presentation, but this idea of open source from our perspective ensures that contributions are made contributions are shared, and that the code for Data for All is code that is essentially owned by the community and managed and grown with the community. The next series of slides refer to underlying data standards, and the first is from our perspective perhaps most critical, and that is SDMX, the Statistical Data and Metadata Exchange. You'll note that in each of these slides there is a reference to further readings on these topics, and I'd encourage you in every case to go further in your research and understanding of these topics. Underlying a DevInfo database is an SDMX approach that allows for standardization of statistical business processes, allowing for really essentially the exchange of statistical data and the metadata that goes with it. SDMX was first used in the European banking system, where they were looking for ways of transferring currency, or data on currency, I should say, at a time when standards didn't exist. The standard applies as well to the financial section as it does to the development sector, in that it allows us to define an indicator, define the metadata around that indicator, to move away from language of an indicator name to codes that make up an indicator name. That allows us then to avoid any issues with language. The indicators become language agnostic because they're based on underlying codes in the way that they were defined. And it allows us, as we look, for example, between line ministries within a country, at the ability to exchange data freely and with confidence, understanding that that data value, that observation, has a shared meaning and a shared understanding. Of course, that exchange of data horizontally is critical, but it's also critical in a vertical system as well, where a province may be sharing data with a central ministry, where a national statistics office may be sharing data in an international way. And the underlying principle of statistical data meta exchange is one that allows that to happen with more confidence and with more efficiency. The next standard that we feel is critical and can't be left behind in any work that we do is a standard around documentation of sources of data, the DDI, or Data Documentation Initiative. And without saying too much here, the idea is around standardizing the naming conventions of sources of data. And I think this, from my perspective, is a critical step in ensuring that the data is well understood, is recognized, and then can be reflected in both monitoring and planning processes at the national level as well. The next standard relates to, in a way, a different type of data, but data that most certainly belongs to the realm of development data, and that is data around finances and financing. The standard here is called IATI, or International Aid Transparency Initiative, and we're looking at here data that very much involves the reporting of financial resources as received from development partners, as committed, expended, utilized toward development aims and development goals. And in our work, we apply IATI standards in any financial reporting mechanism that we're using, and I'll show some examples to follow. And the last standard is one around geospatial data. And again, I would encourage you to look more deeply at all of these if they are of interest to you, but the OGC, or the Open Geospatial Consortium, is one that, from our perspective, sets a standard for the use of geospatial content and the services surrounding it. With that said, I'd like to move now from a discussion of how we see a transition taking place from DevInfo to Data for All. And in the section that just preceded this, I was setting out what we feel are the underpinning of that transition, which are the standards for data and the standards of how we define data in the system. Now, for the next few minutes, I'd like to provide a few examples of projects that are being implemented around the world where Data for All tools are being used. These examples come with much more content here. I'm just showing a few slides and giving you a summary of the initiative, but we'd be very happy to either put you in touch with those who are implementing these projects or share more details about them. To say at this point that CSF is working always in partnership with either agencies or national government or local government for that matter. And our approach is one of providing support, providing capacity building, and one where we aim to leave a country or ministry with tools that they can be managed independently and with autonomy. We're there to support, but we feel that we're successful when we can leave a project with full implementation in the hands of our counterparts. These are a few examples of projects in progress now, and I'll talk them through over the next few minutes. The first project comes from Sudan, and I have not seen this reported anywhere, but I think Sudan may be able to claim the first SDG data dashboard in the world, perhaps. They're quite early in taking initiative to begin to report out on SDG indicators and goals. And we've been very pleased and proud to be able to support that work in strengthening and building a national SDG monitoring platform. I want to talk a bit about tools before I talk about the output of those tools. You remember I showed you a few minutes ago a toolkit with many different categories and types of tools to capture, manage, analyze, and strategize with data. This is an example of the formula, if you will, being used in Sudan, where we're using different applications to support the larger monitoring system for the SDGs. At the heart of this, of course, is the data warehouse, which I mentioned previously. Data Manager is a tool to build and maintain the data warehouse. Here, you're importing standardized indicators, you're creating new indicators, you're managing the templates and structures of the data warehouse. The Data Manager allows you to establish import of data from different sources. It allows you to address data entry as needed and the management of the system as a whole. One limitation of DevInfo that we've heard repeatedly is that from a data management perspective, it was always very much a manual process of entering data. And through DFA and new technologies, we're working on tools to avoid any sort of manual data entry. That, of course, is possible if needed. But through Data Manager, we're able to leverage now more efficient ways of importing and accessing data, referencing existing data, for example, to populate the data warehouse. Once the data is there, we've been working with our counterparts on dissemination, and in three ways. First is to develop a dashboard, a data dashboard that's live and online. I'll show you some screens of that next. And then to develop accompanying profiles. These are static, standard data profiles by geographic area, subnationally released, so that we can see a clear understanding of progress on SDGs at subnational levels. And the third piece of analysis or data dissemination that we're working on is the release of data through a mobile app. And I believe this app is available now. You can go to the Google Play Store or the Apple Store to download that, if not now, very soon, and have access to data driven from the Sudan data warehouse. All of this is underpinned by a capacity building program. And as I mentioned, our aim is to leave countries with capacity to manage these systems. And so as you see from this slide, the capacity building extends from the management of data to the management of the visualization and the use of data, and something that is an ongoing process in this project. Here's an example of the outputs from Sudan. From left to right, you see a screenshot of a data dashboard, and we'd be happy to provide links for you so that you can manipulate and review the data yourself. Underlying the graphs that you see here are the data sets themselves, and it's always very important in our perspective that we don't separate the actual data tables from the sources. So you can always find your data set behind or with associated with the visualization. More to the center of this slide is an example of the profile that I mentioned. Very similar you see in perhaps content, a bit different in design and our approach, but the idea here is to present a singular view of standard indicators that can be arranged geographically. This has always proven to be very helpful advocacy tool, particularly for parliamentarians, for high-level decision makers who need to have a very snapshot view of information to either make decisions or to inform discussion. And to the far right, as you can imagine, this is a mobile app, as I mentioned, that supports the dissemination of data out of the data warehouse. The next example is from Côte d'Ivoire. Again, an approach of monitoring the SDGs and also national priorities, but taken from a bit of a different perspective. And I think this is a very critical example to discuss here, and one that we're very excited about for many reasons. In Côte d'Ivoire, it's not only about the presentation of the results, the development outcome indicators, but also the monitoring of national plans for the achievement of the SDG goals and national development goals as a whole. So you see here a fairly similar set of tools with two exceptions. On the far right, we're introducing a tool called DFA monitoring. And from our perspective, this represents the possibility of looking at a results matrix in a way that allows for a more detailed understanding of progress against targets, progress against plans for the achievement of goals. And we'll look at this in a conceptual way in the next slide. Here's an example of the system that's been conceived in Côte d'Ivoire. From the top left, you see an example of a results matrix from the National Development Plan of Côte d'Ivoire. As most development plans, this is multi-sectoral and covers agriculture, labor, health, education, child protection, nutrition, etc. But as you know, in working in this field, a plan like this will have indicators that will monitor certain targets, the goals of the plan. And at that high level, these indicators are very much appropriate. These indicators, however, aren't sufficient in fully monitoring and using data in any of the sectors that the plan covers. So in Côte d'Ivoire, they're conceiving of a federated system where the National Development Plan is being monitored with a set of indicators. And each sectoral plan, as you see in the center of the slide, would share common indicators, but also have a broader set of indicators. In education, for example, both for the monitoring of the education sector plan, and then for sharing of indicators for the monitoring of the National Development Plan, and so forth in the other sectors in the national government. What we see here as an important breakthrough is moving away from a silo approach to data, using the kind of standards that we talked about earlier to reference either a single or a set of federated data warehouses that allows for data to be shared, so that the number 76, as it relates to literacy rate, can be referenced one time from one place in many different monitoring frameworks, and in use in data dissemination, and in use in a mobile application, for example. This allows then for more efficiencies and I think a higher degree of accuracy in data as it comes to development data. We see this really at the core as statistical information system strengthening, and one that's I think has great potential both in and with national partners, but also with UN agencies as well. To the top right of this slide, you see a logo for SDMX, and that's there for a reason, because this kind of approach then takes on a set of shared indicators with shared metadata related to them. And oftentimes these systems are developed using an indicator registry, so that a single repository of indicators can be referenced in building out these plans at the national level or within the sectors that they're dealing with specifically. This is a very simple screenshot of the output of the system, a dashboard here to give indication of the kind of indicators that are being captured and the measurements that are being undertaken in measuring and monitoring the National Development Plan in Côte d'Ivoire. The next example is one that doesn't represent a project at the country level, but in fact a regional project, and that is the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, Regional Monitoring and Activity Tracking. I wanted to share this example because I think it also reflects quite an exciting technology that's being applied not only in this project, but also in others as well, and that's enhanced use of mapping. Again, a recipe, if you will, of the kind of technology that's being packaged together to support this initiative. Here you see many of the same components with the addition of mapper and advocacy materials. I want to highlight advocacy materials here because for IGAD, they see this communication campaign surrounding the project is equally important in ensuring that the project has sustainability and is being used. And in the next slides, I'll discuss more about the mapping tool that's being deployed with the IGAD project. It strikes me that in this webinar, there may be participants from these project countries, and I'd be very happy to hear, as we go into the discussion phase of the project, any comments you may have or insights from implementation. The mapping functionality that we're introducing in the IGAD project and elsewhere is one that we refer to, I think is referred to most commonly as a 3W map. That is, who is doing what and where. And that allows you to look not necessarily at development outcomes, but the kind of activities that go into achieving those outcomes. This is the first view of the data from the region. And you see on the the right-hand side, a very mini dashboard to overview the financing of this particular set of projects, so you can understand more about budget commitments, number of projects and their funding sources, etc. And as we begin to drill into the data, we have at our disposal the kind of filters that would be helpful in understanding and parsing out the information that's most relevant, whether it's a sector, a region, a funding year, size of funding source, size of funding or source, for example, and that all can be filtered through the system as well. And then we get to a point where we can drill down and look at the data. And here we're looking at a set of projects in Djibouti. You see they're represented in number in the circles on this map. And each of those represent a specific project implemented in that particular region. And as we drill down, we can see then a next level of information on the status of the project. We can select then one of the projects is to understand a summary of that project, and then to even go further and look at the project overview. This is where we now begin to apply the standard that I mentioned earlier called IATI, where we're looking at finances for development and a chance to not only report out on development outcomes, but also on development finances as well. The final project I'll speak to is the one that represents, in our mind, I think the most ambitious effort to capture data for the SDGs, and that is the Open EMIS initiative. So far, I've been speaking largely about managing data and disseminating it. And the Open EMIS project in Jordan and in many countries, I think, represents, from our perspective, a very important and significant step in capturing data, and in this case, strengthening administrative information systems in education particularly. The Open EMIS project is a collaboration between UNESCO and CSF, where CSF is a technical partner for implementation. Open EMIS is open for the reasons I described earlier, open source and one that supports an idea of open data. And EMIS is Education Management Information Systems. This system, as you may know, EMIS is traditionally a system of collecting regular reports from schools and compiling that data for central, regional planning purposes and decision making. A traditional EMIS would capture aggregated data at the school level and report that up the system to allow for the production of indicators like enrollment rates, etc. OpenEMIS takes that same approach, but also then allows for the next level of data capture to occur, and I think a level of data capture that really speaks to the heart of SDGs. OpenEMIS provides an opportunity to collect data at the individual level. So not as a school as a whole with 26 boys and 36 girls, but information on each of those students as individuals. And data on students, data on staff, and data on the institution. And as you'll see in a few minutes, that allows for, I think, a very rich data set and the ability to really look at leaving no one behind in the education sector. The first example I'll share, though, is an example from Jordan, and this is a dashboard live, published now, displaying key performance indicators from across the education sector in Jordan. This dashboard is generated, produced with data coming out of OpenEMIS, but also coming from other sources as well. And I'll pause there to say that the data warehouse that I've been describing also is one that is able to consume data from external sources. And I think in the case of the OpenEMIS project, this is critical. An example is the indicator I just mentioned, net enrollment ratio, where not only do you need to know how many students are enrolled in schools, but of course you need to know overall population figures to capture and produce that indicator. And so within the data warehouse, we're able to consume data. The data is then generated into indicators and displayed in dashboards like this one. Another type of dashboard created using data from the OpenEMIS system is here, a dashboard on data collection itself. And you see here now much more of a geospatial approach to data capture. This one is looking at multiple indicators on a map and allowing analysis of school populations based on both the size and color and position of the dots on this map. The OpenEMIS project in Jordan began at a time when the ministry was looking for solutions to better track Syrian refugee populations studying in Jordan. The system has been deployed and is now live and collecting data at the school level in all schools in the country, and is aimed at supporting central and very much local decision making in education. One thing we found in implementation of OpenEMIS, not only in Jordan but beyond, is that once there's an incentive and a value in better data at the local level, data becomes better. It becomes more comprehensive and the coverage is better and the data quality is also improved. In a traditional EMIS, as I described earlier, oftentimes the school was required to report up the system, but they never had access back to the data, and the data was never of much use at that level. With a system that allows for the collection of individual student data, it becomes a student information system for the school, allowing the school to use that data for decisions and for planning purposes. And also then reporting up the system to the central ministry for their reporting purposes as well. This is an example of the tool that is capturing data in OpenEMIS. It's called OpenEMIS Core. And I'll just show you a few slides of what that data capture tool looks like. This is a view of at the institution level, and you can see the different records here, 45 institutions in this example from a range of localities. Shows here at a mini dashboard level the number of students in the entire system. I'm showing now examples that come from dummy data, not from Jordan or any country, because we're going to begin to look at the student records that I described. And of course, for confidentiality reasons, it's important not to begin looking at actual students, but here's an example of some dummy data. We're drilling down into one of the schools on this list, and this is called Aben Park Primary. And we see here now at the school level, again, a miniature dashboard of the school and each student record of students studying in that particular school. Beyond a photo, of course, I think most importantly, we have an ID here, and this is called an Open EMIS ID. This can be generated by the system in the case where a country may not have a national identification number, or it can be imported in the case where that number exists. But critical to the student record is a unique identifier, and that comes here. If you look at the top set of tabs within this view, you see that there's an ability to capture data on an individual student in many, many different ways. And you see here, for example, languages, special needs, information about guardians, identities, nationalities, etc. And then there's an open-ended field here where we can begin to capture data at the student level, at the staff level, on any type of information required. This also includes performance in education, attendance, behavior, and results in education as well. Here's a look at the students' program and participation. You see that this is a view of a student who's just only starting school, but as the student progresses through the education system, their record of participation in each grade, in each institution goes forward as well. If the student is transferring from one school to another, that is also then reflected here, and the student is passed through the system in a single record from one institution to the next. Here's an example of information about student health. We were just participating in the Statistical Commission, the annual commission here in New York, held at the UN. And one of the topics of discussion was around not only health information, but information about disability or differing abilities. And here within this sect of data in Open EMIS Core, we can not only collect information about health, but also about differing abilities. And we're very happy to have leveraged work done by UNICEF and the Washington Group on functional classification of disabilities to allow a teacher to document and record information on each student so that that information can be more widely used. Again, this information is critical for a teacher, for a school to address the needs of their student body. But having information on each student then allows for the production of indicators and the reporting out on both national priorities and the SDGs as well. I'm just following along in the chat and seeing that some of you aren't able to see the screen consistently. I think that a refresh generally will work. If not, I apologize for that. The slides and the presentation will be made available, so I'm hoping you're able to listen in and then refer back to the recording if you're not able to see the screens at this stage. I'm showing now an example or a video coming from Jordan, and encourage you to spend a few minutes to watch that. We won't do that today together, but it's I think a great testament of the system as it's being used at the school level, at the central ministry level for strengthening information systems. So with that, I've aim to give you an overview of some of the activities that are ongoing. I wanted to reflect on how Data for All is being applied in the field. Many of the tools that we have shown have been developed in the last years. Once they've been developed in this open source model, then they're available. And CSF is there to support the configuration and the setup of the tool. They come with no licensing fees or royalties associated with them. Some of the tools that we are displaying here are tools that we foresee to be used, tools in a roadmap for development in the coming months. And we'd encourage you to suggest areas where, in fact, there may be ideas that we've not yet considered and would be very helpful in strengthening the suite of tools under the DFA initiative. As a next step, we'd be very happy to engage with you more directly. If you have ideas or suggestions, if you have a project implementation that you'd like to discuss, I'm certainly available to discuss with you at any time how implementation could take place. My colleague Javita, I've copied here with email address as well, is working in areas of our program portfolio development, and would be happy to discuss with you potential for a work plan. I wanted to share examples to give you some sense of what's possible, but your ideas are the ideas that will drive any initiative forward. And so in this case, if you have suggestions of implementation, we'd be very excited to hear your needs and see if we can find solutions to fit those needs. From a more administrative perspective, working with CSF often involves a contractual process, and if you're coming from a UN agency or a partner agency, you understand that can take time. We're very happy to have several long-term agreements with the UN system in place that will allow for relatively quick procurement processes that allows us to get to the work quickly. Our projects tend to run from anywhere from a few weeks to several years. In larger implementations like an OpenEMIS implementation, we anticipate that that could be a 2 or 3 year project. But if it's building a dashboard or a mobile app, that could be done relatively quickly, and we certainly are here to support at whatever level and whatever scale is required. With that, I'll leave you with a final screen, which is a way to be in touch with us beyond the email address. You're welcome to visit the Data for All website. There's a contact form there directly, and that will lodge your name, details, and put someone in touch with you very quickly to discuss what you feel is critical. If you have questions specifically or ideas for implementation, we'd be very happy to hear from you. And with that, this is my final slide. It's where I began. I'd like to propose now that if anyone has questions from the floor, we'd be very open to taking them. I'll ask my colleague Javita to engage her mic, and if there's questions in the chat, we can deal with those first, and then any questions from participants we'd be happy to take thereafter. Thank you for your attention, and look forward to the discussion to follow.
John, this is Javita. We do have a series of questions right now. We have one from Maezo. If you can see the chat, John.
Javita, would you mind reading out questions for all of us, and then we can respond quickly.
So a question from Maezo would be, as part of data capturing, is DFA able to link or handshake with already existing national data systems, such as health information systems or education systems, which can be used as real-time data sources? This is the question we have from Maezo, John. You'd like to ask?
That's a great question. And the answer is, a short answer is yes. Of course, it's critical for us to understand the technology and the approach used in the existing systems that are in place. But I'm quite confident with APIs and other approaches of information sharing that there's ways of doing this, and that can easily be done. I should say that one of the first steps we take in I think more complex projects would be to take a needs assessment, visit to the country, and to understand the technical requirements, the program requirements of the project. In the case of, as you just mentioned, I think quite rightly, there would be a need to look at the technologies used in other systems, but there certainly are ways of linking and handshaking to make that data exchange possible. On top of that, of course, is the need to have a strong data policy at the country, and oftentimes that is something that follows a demand. If it's not in place, that's something that would certainly then that would follow, and it would be something that would guide and sustain any kind of process.
John, I have another question now from Vincenzo, who is asking whether we have any ongoing agreement with UNICEF. If yes, is it at a global, regional, or national level? Over to you, John.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we do, in fact, and we have several global agreements in place with UNICEF. One of them is very sector-specific in the nutrition sector, but another is quite generally available for the use of and support to data-driven initiatives. And that is a global LTA that can be leveraged at any level within the UN system. For those who aren't familiar with long-term agreements, if you're you're working within the UN system, if one agency has an LTA, if you come from another agency, you're often able to leverage that same agreement and then move very quickly through procurement processes. So the fact that there's LTA with UNICEF would mean that UN Women has and does leverage that LTA. Other agencies do the same. And we're happy to share more details about that if you have specific questions about it.
John, there is a question from Desiree asking what types of programs are used to build the dashboards?
Yeah, thank you, Desiree. The tool that I described earlier in the presentation is something we called Dashboard Builder. In fact, we didn't want to just build a dashboard and hand it over to a country. We wanted to create a tool that would allow that data administrator to create his or her own dashboard. So we've in fact developed a tool, we call it Dashboard Builder, where we also build our dashboards and provide the tool for counterparts to do it themselves. It's one of those, I would say, DIY approaches, do it yourself if you would like to. And we feel like this is a very critical step in sustainability. So that Dashboard Builder tool is available, and it's something that we use for our own work, but we also will put it in the hands of any project so that they have the ability to do that themselves. Now, that being said, we also are approached very regularly by different agencies that may have agreements ongoing with proprietary software and proprietary tools. So we're working on a project now where we're using proprietary tools from Microsoft and other tools to build dashboards. But our main strategy and approach is very much this open source approach and using things that come without licenses.
John, a question from Fleming. He's saying we have been using DevInfo 7 for management of our transport sector data. Is there an option of migration and addition of more of the tools in the DFA? And just wait a minute. And he also asked, if yes, what are the requirements? End of the question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Those two questions are really at the heart of what this presentation really aims to discuss. So underlying your DevInfo 7 is a data warehouse, and that data warehouse is very much able to make a transition into using and leveraging data for all tools. So these tools exist. We'd be very happy to discuss with you more specifically how to do that. In this case, you would not be losing the ability to leverage and use the data that's existing in your DevInfo 7 database, but then on top of that, you would have the ability to use new tools for both importing or capturing more data, but also stronger tools for the use of that data once it's in the system. Requirements, essentially, as the database is in DevInfo 7 format, I think the requirements have been met in that regard, and we'd be very happy to have a more detailed technical discussion with you to better understand how that can be used specifically.
John, there is a question from, I'm sorry, it's just moving in very fast. There is a question from UNICEF India, from Ganesh Nigam, asking whether, I'm sorry, do we have any example of improving data quality by using incentive? This is his question.
Ganesh, that's a really great question, because we know that oftentimes one of the weaknesses of the system is the data quality itself. And I guess the example that I began with is one that I feel quite strongly about, which is when data capture is required or data collection is required, if people ever able to make that data relevant to those who are responsible for collecting it, I think it increases as an inherent incentive the quality of the data. So at one level, I feel that this is an example of how data quality can be improved. And the Open EMIS initiative is doing that. It's really very much about making data relevant at the level where it's being captured so that there is an incentive and value in capturing and collecting better data. Another example I would say is something that happens quite naturally as data dissemination takes place. You can imagine, for example, when the first dashboard is released for any country in the world, if you're looking at a sector or a region in that particular country, if there are data gaps, suddenly those data gaps are very visible. If there seems to be data inconsistencies, those become very visible as well. And we found that I guess we could call that light pressure, perhaps, that's applied when data is disseminated, often leads to improvements in quality of both coverage and quality of data itself. So we're quite we would always support, to the extent it's possible and appropriate, to begin to build the outputs quickly, so that the data can certainly become available, visible, and we can begin to work on data quality issues early on.
We're on the next question from Luca.
Javita?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
From Luca now. So what are the issue of data comparability among different countries, given different methodological approaches and or definition to gather data?
Yeah, that's a very important question, Luca, and one that I think I've addressed to some degree in the discussion of data standards, particularly STMX. But I think this gets to the heart of some of the issues that we look at when we talk about internationally comparable data and national sources of data. I come from the education sector, where working with the UNESCO Institute of Statistics, it was an organization that produced annually a set of internationally comparable indicators, which meant that country data was recast, recalculated, and then made comparable. And at that level, that comparability was defined by the methodology that UIS applied. When indicators are calculated nationally, of course, this means that perhaps the calculation, the source of data will differ, and comparability is an issue. I think the underlying metadata then is what's critical in ensuring that we understand, to use an expression, when we can compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges. And I think it's important to lean on and rely on sound metadata to be sure that can take place. So this is a much broader discussion. Perhaps I'll stop my answer there, but certainly it's a critical issue, and we feel that the metadata that underlines the database is most important.
John will take the next question from Desiree. She's asking, how can we apply for the dashboard builder?
Yeah, thanks, Desiree. And that's I think a general question, perhaps, if not only for Dashboard Builder, but if there's interest in any of the tools that we've just been discussing today, by all means, please reach out to either Javita or I directly by email, or through the Data for All contact form, and we can discuss how that application works, how we could foresee it being deployed in your context, and if there's any particular training that might be helpful in going ahead with that.
John will take the next question from Amit, who is asking which software is being used for geospatial analysis.
Yeah, thank you for that. We use several different open source software solutions in our work. One that we've been working with on particular projects is a tool called Mapbox. That's one application that's been, or one technology that's been applied. But we're also very open to the differing tools that are being used for geospatial analysis, and we always are looking for ways of incorporating other solutions into our toolkit. So we're quite open to leveraging different technologies in this particular case. I'd be very happy to have a more detailed discussion with you on that. I'm afraid with time at this stage, I won't say much more than that now, but would be happy to discuss further.
John, the next question from Regis asking, what is the transition plan concerning the hosting and management of national databases being done by DFA? Is this undergoing agreement with UNICEF as said?
Yeah, thank you for that, Francois. Essentially, from our perspective, we realize that with all of the very intense work that's happened in countries around the world, it's critical that when there's necessary to have a transition plan, we want it to be ready with one. Perhaps I'll say a bit more about our current agreement with UNICEF as it relates to DevInfo and our direction forward with Data for All. UNICEF has announced that the DevInfo initiative will formally end at the end of this year, and CSF is continuing to provide support to DevInfo in this time. So while the ongoing agreement for DevInfo support remains, we see it critical to think beyond that and plan for beyond that. And so our transition plan then goes into an approach where we're looking at ways of leveraging now new technologies and moving towards data for all. Our agreements and long-term agreements I described with UNICEF earlier are more generic in terms of support to data dissemination systems, but those can be leveraged for this kind of work. In terms of hosting and management of national databases being done by DFA specifically, there's several ways of approaching hosting. This is not something that we foresee to be covered under a global project at this stage, but the cost for hosting a database can either be handled locally with a local hosting, or it can be hosted using the cloud, and it's something that we are discussing with all country implementation at the moment, and would be happy to discuss that further. We use Amazon Web Services for hosting, but we are very much aware that countries have different data policies, and the hosting of databases and requirements around that differ country to country. So we're responsive as we can be to the differing requirements, that said.
John, a question from Arjita asking, from previous experience with DevInfo, you could build a basic database with no assistance from CSF. Is it still the case for DFA, or your assistance is required from the beginning? This is her question.
Yeah, thanks, Arjita. That's a great question. And I guess one of the differences that is important for us to identify here is the difference in, and maybe we should talk about DevInfo 6 for those who worked at that time, which was a desktop application. And having DevInfo on your desktop meant it was quite easy to begin to build a database just there and work directly on your own system and building a local database. I think the only assistance that may be required as we begin to implement DFA is the question that we just responded to earlier, which is around hosting. As Data for All is generally a web solution or a cloud solution, then the instance would need to be hosted, and then the building of that database could commence. And I think that you would find the data manager tools for building a database are fairly simple to use, and once the system is launched and hosted, then you could get directly into the work of building a database. So I don't see the administration of a database as an issue, but maybe the launch of the application would be the only issue that would perhaps change the equation in moving from DevInfo to DFA.
Last two questions, John. One from Sylvester asking, are the UK and US SDG online platforms running on the DFA platform?
Yeah, thanks, Sylvester. I appreciate that question. And as many of you may know, the US and UK are collaborating together on an SDG reporting platform, a national reporting platform. At this stage, these are not using Data for All technologies, but we've been in discussions with actually with both governments, and we're very much open to collaborating and sharing tools in support of building those platforms. But the platform was built also as an open source tool, but not using Data for All technologies.
John, the last question from Desiree. How do you deal effectively with open... This is her question.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very important question, Desiree, particularly as I was sharing an example of student records in the education system. And here I think it's really critical to ensure that data policy and legislation is harmonized and aligned, and that systems then respond to national requirements for using data, and especially individual student records. From our perspective, what we tend and try to do is to respond to the policies in place in a particular country. And if there are gray areas within that policy, especially as technologies evolve and the availability of data also evolves, we try then to inform and engage with government counterparts, especially to support strengthening of those data policies to respond to the technology. It's a big question. It's one that many countries are worried about and are thinking a lot about in this case, but we're finding that strong policies allow us to move forward with technology. Let's take one more, if that's okay, and then I know we've run just over our 1 hour allotment. I appreciate all the questions, and perhaps with this last one we can then close. And as I mentioned earlier, we'd be very happy to continue discussions offline, by email, in separate follow-up phone calls as you see necessary.
Yes, John, there's a last question from Prasoon, asking, I've been using DevInfo for thematic maps, and wherein these maps can be prepared in local language of the state. Preparing dashboards in state language will enhance the use of this platform. Over to you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. So Nat, we fully agree, and it's something I should have mentioned in my presentation, and I failed to do that. All Data for All tools are open to be applied in any language, and from that perspective, both the content of the database, let's say, could be developed in local language, and the application itself can also be developed in local language. Example is in Jordan, where OpenEMIS is deployed in Arabic. It's also deployed in French, English, and can be applied in any language in that case. That's the application itself. The contents, which could be the indicators, the contents of the database, also can be generated in local language. And we also feel this is critical for really, as you're saying here, better use of these data and acceptance and recognition of the data coming in local languages. So something that we feel very strongly about, and we've built into the new system as well. So with that, I want to say once again, thank you on behalf of Community Systems Foundation. We very much appreciated the presentation, the time to discuss with you after the webinar, and we look forward to follow up with all of you. As I mentioned, this webinar has been recorded and will be shared. We'll make a link available if you'd like to have access to the recording, to the slides, but more importantly, to whatever you feel are appropriate next steps. We're here to support and would be very happy to discuss with you further. Please don't hesitate to be in touch, and we wish you a good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world, and look forward to engaging with you soon. Thank you.